Although many people are working from home now because of the coronavirus pandemic, trends indicate that the office is not obsolete. In fact, John Jack, CEO of Galetti Corporate Real Estate, argues that although the purpose of the office has evolved, it still plays a crucial role in corporate life. He says there's no denying the increased productivity of employees once they feel that they're in a structured, creative and collaborative environment. He believes standalone temporary structures are the perfect solution for those wishing to occupy their own sanitized space. I'm now joined by John Jack, CEO of Galetti Corporate Real Estate. How big are corporates coping with planned offices? John, good morning. Great to see you.
Morning. How are you?
So obviously the landscape has changed massively in the last year and a bit. Take us through some of those changes as far as office occupancy is concerned.
You know, it changes from day to day. About a month ago, I was saying, our basement had filled up so much. We've got this sort of super basement that sits under a number of structures at Melrose Arch. And it had filled up so much, it was almost at 70% occupancy. Now, today, I drove there on Friday, given that it's a Friday, but it was sort of 20% full. So day to day, it fluctuates. And right in the middle of lockdown, the hard lockdown last year, obviously no one was in the office, and there was, it was a bit of a catastrophe for office in general. But as soon as it started to lighten up, people started coming back to the office, and that environment started to pick up again. Largely, I think, because that's where you sort of innovate, that's where you create a culture, that's where people come together as a business, industry dependent.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. Obviously, if you work in a hospital, then you have to work from the hospital. So what sort of industries do you find are not so keen on coming back to the office?
Yeah. So you've seen the major corporates, so the likes of Discovery, the insurers, et cetera, just because of the number of people that they have in those offices, thousands of people, they have to issue statements where they say, right, it's only going to be 50% of people allowed to work in this office, or at least you're only allowed to work in the office 50% of your week. And so there's a definite trend there to open up space and to move people apart and to have that type of environment. The smaller guys, specifically the sales industry, anything that's in consulting or where people need to be together to talk, to engage, et cetera, they were back at the office quite quickly. IT, definitely staying away from the office. Engineering, where you're actually working on your own programs. And so those thought workers, they were away from the office because they could actually do it. They could stay at home and actually knock those projects out. They didn't need to sit and engage as much. And when they did need to sit and engage, they could actually go and have those meetings at that sort of common space.
But obviously a lot of that would make sense for employers to keep their staff away from the office. I mean, certainly a lot of your costs would come down. Do you find that a lot of employers are kind of more focused on that?
Yeah, employers, yeah. So, I mean, everyone's trying to reduce costs across the board, but what's actually happened is the market's adapted on that basis. So, because there's so much less demand and so much more vacancy, obviously rentals have trended downward to meet it. So naturally your rental overhead has come down just as a matter of course. Then secondly, what people are doing when they're signing new leases, if they were to take 1,000 squares, now they're only taking 700 squares, and the additional 300 squares they take on a more flexible basis. So if they need to, they can get rid of it. But an interesting trend that we've actually seen is a lot of sublets came to market. So everyone wanted to sublet their space. They still had a lease running out for another couple of years. And they put it on the market. And recently, sort of 2-3 months ago, they started to pull those out of the market to say, actually, we're just going to hold on to this office space. We're not just going to, sublet and take it to market. So that helps landlords quite a lot because you can imagine a landlord's trying to achieve a return. So he's trying to get a reasonable rental. Whereas in a sublet, anything you get is okay because it's just you're netting off. It's something's better than nothing. So it's interesting to see those leaving the market, which will provide a little bit of stability for the landlords, yeah.
John, I've driven past many office blocks in Johannesburg that have been empty for months. Almost prior to COVID, I can imagine that situation has exacerbated. Give us an indication of percentage, just how much available office space is actually unoccupied.
Yeah. And it's very nodal, so it's very specific. But, for example, we had a client with a requirement of 3,000 square meters the other day, going to markets, testing the market. And, so we go to central Johannesburg, that's Bryanston, Lower, et cetera, and, there are 2-3 options in the Rosebanks, in the Bryanston, whatever. In Sandton, there are about 15 options that they could look at. So Sandton is where all of the pain is at the moment. You're probably looking at vacancies of up to 30%. If you start adding sublets, you're probably higher than 30%. It's enormous. You can literally go anywhere you want. And point at a building in Sandton, you can probably get it if you want it.
So now we talked a little bit about social distancing within the workspace. Has therefore been a shift from those, for instance, that would normally go for an office block to maybe an office in a residential area, for instance, that has a garden and allows more social distancing in that regard?
Not really, What people have started to realize is that, you went back to your office immediately and, in the first, when we started lightening up, and you'd get there and then every second desk had like an X on it or some kind of like COVID warning or whatever it is. So it looks like some crime scene when you go back to the office. And what everyone's realized is that actually you don't need to do that. You just need to sort of pack away the desks that you aren't going to use and separate your work areas to make it a more inviting environment as opposed to this crime scene that everyone had. Also, people are having things like, let's be alone together. Let's work in the atriums. Let's work in the in the staff canteen, because it's very negative energy to see a canteen which is just empty with one person sitting there. Usually you'd go there, you'd socialize, you'd have a coffee, you'd meet your other staff members and that type of thing. But people are trying to make a better environment. So all that's happening with offices is they're changing the environment, they're changing the design. They're changing the layout. They're changing the wellness areas. They're giving people more flexibility. They say you only have to be at work 50% of the week. And it's just changing the way that we use the office as opposed to relocating the office to another area.
Now, the one industry where I've picked up some changes in the banking sector, many of my friends that work in the banks are not going to work or to the office for at least the next 12 months.
Yeah. It's very much the trend. Standard Bank is sitting empty at the moment. What has happened is it's actually had a knock-on on how efficient people are being at the banks, being able to have funding approved, for example. It's taking much longer than it would normally take, and this is from a commercial real estate perspective. The teams aren't able to meet as effectively, and that's really the problem that it's creating in the banks. You can imagine how much paperwork flows through banks. So they're really having to rely on their IT spend is going up. And so people are relying on that technology to actually make it work into the future. And I think that the banks will really continue to work on a more agile basis. I don't think these massive buildings that you see housing the banks, I do think they're a thing of the past. I think they will be far smaller. They will continue to exist, but there will be far more collaborative / meeting areas in those banks as opposed to rows and rows of desks. That's not going to happen.
Now, some spaces, I believe, have been converted from office space to residential spaces. I was speaking to a colleague who noticed a block somewhere in Randburg that used to be an office space. Now, with the requirement for office space diminishing, accommodations requirements still remain on the high?
It's an interesting one. So that's been a trend in Randburg for a long time. We're talking sort of at least 10 years already. But in Sandton, it wasn't really a trend as much as it has been in the last couple of years. So if you take Athol Yards and Dennis Road in Athol, if you take in Fredman Drive, the ex-SAB headquarters is now a building called Black Brick, which is a common accommodation / club / lounge area, dining. It's very much a live and work from the same place, the same building. So quite an interesting concept. And what's actually happening is these are very, very small accommodations. So what people might be doing is moving to what they call Zoom towns further away, but they still maintain a very, very small accommodation in town. In Sandton, for example, it's literally a bedroom, and it might have a library that you can go to and somewhere to eat, for example, a gym. but it's not your sort of standard bigger accommodation that you maintain around the buildings. So that's what's happened. People have almost hedged. They've moved further away, but when you do need to be in town, you've got a much smaller 20 square meters, 30 square meters type of accommodation. Big trend in Cape Town CBD, by the way, as well. You look at the Harry and developments like it, it's very much a live, work, play type of environment. And so people are getting closer to the CBD and maybe closer to a New York type of trend where we're very far behind on that sort of very small accommodation and then live outside of the house. So we're seeing all sorts of interesting trends. Residential property has skyrocketed. There's lots and lots of demand for it, and prices have moved upward. It's a global trend. You look at Sweden, I think their sort of price increases in housing or residential was upward of 50% in 1 year. So it's all sorts of strange trends emerging from the COVID environment. But what is happening is people want flexibility. They value their families more. They value spending time outdoors more. And so companies like that are really, really benefiting from it. Anything that has anything to do with home improvement or travel, local travel, so tents and canopies and that type of car, all benefiting massively from the COVID environment.
COVID has certainly taught us a lot more than we would ever anticipated to have learned from it. Now, where does all of this put the young entrepreneurs or the new businesses, the small businesses? Does this offer them an opportunity to find some office space because the rentals have come down?
Yeah, I think definitely. But what's really happening is that you've got to remember that the young entrepreneurs are coming out of, chatting to some of my mates, they've got their kids going to university. Their first year of university is at home. You're online. So their entire way of thinking, of starting a business, we're almost old school. I'm 40 this year, and I'm now considered old school in the way that I think. Maybe having an office, they think completely agile. It's natural to have and start your business this way. You can, I met a guy the other day. He has an online education business based in South Africa, based in Cape Town. They literally only sell into the American market. And this was started in the last year, called IX. And this is the type of thing that's happening, is that people don't think the same way anymore. And yes, there are opportunities and better and far more affordable ways to create office, but it's going to be used differently. They're going to be more creative spaces. They're going to be interesting offices, somewhere where you want to go to, you want to spend and build your team, and it's just going to be very different, I think. And yes, landlords are offering the best incentives at the moment. You can get rent free. They will fit your office out for you. You can sign a flexible lease. They will give you capex up front. So in terms of starting a new office or starting a new lease, the biggest hindrance has always been the capital outlay to start that new office. It's usually 12 months to 18 months, depending on the kind of spec you're going for. And now the landlords literally pay for that. And that makes a massive, massive difference for new entrepreneurs starting. So there are positive things coming out of it, which is quite exciting.
John Jack, CEO of Galetti Corporate Real Estate, thank you for your time this morning.